This one is about named ranges and named cells and regions to be specific. We're going to first cover the naming rules and naming conventions that have to be adhered to when you're naming a cell or a region. And then we're going to name some cells using the 4 different ways in which you can do that. And we'll use one of those ways to name a region. And then we're going to cover the 6 main uses for naming a cell or a region. So I have a worksheet set up with some naming conventions and rules that need to be adhered to when you're naming a cell or a region. And then I have a list of ways to define a named range or a named cell. I've got some data that we're going to use. And then I have a list of the common uses for naming a cell or a region. So to begin with, when you're naming a cell or a region, the names can't be more than 255 characters long. They're not case sensitive, which is actually a help when you're defining the names. They can't contain spaces. They can only begin with a letter, an underscore, or a backslash. They can only include letters, numbers, periods, question marks, and underscores, and they cannot be the same as a valid cell address. There are 4 names that you should never use: print underscore area, and the other 3 are listed there because Excel uses these ranges for its own purposes. And the best thing to do is just to develop a convention that satisfies the rules and just stick with it, just use it. And there's an example of a named range that would be valid, that's readable and understandable. So how do we set up a named range? We're going to start by naming some cells. And we'll begin by using the name box. First, I'm going to select the cell that I want to name, which is L23, the commission percent. Left-click the name box and type in the name you want to assign to that cell. Press Enter, because if you don't press Enter, you won't assign the name. And we've named cell L23 Commission. I'm going to assign a name to cell L18 by going to the Formulas tab in the Define Names group, left-clicking Define Names, left-clicking Define Name. And Excel has intelligently picked up the fact that maybe I want to name this range COGS for cost of goods sold. We're going to skip the scope for now, and we can put a comment in case somebody may not know what COGS stands for, and are actually other acronyms that are used to describe the same thing. COS I've seen before, cost of sales, and refers to the worksheet, and L18 is correct with an absolute reference. We see the dollar signs. I'm going to left click OK. So that's the second way we can define a cell name. We can also use some functionality in the Define Names group to create simultaneously several named cells at the same time. I've selected K11 to L14, and I'm going to left click Create from Selection, and Excel has correctly guessed that I want to use the names from the left column of my selected range. And we're not going to assign a name to this entire region. We're going to assign 4 names, one for each of the quarters. I'm going to left click OK. We don't see anything until we left click the name manager, which we can also call up by pressing Control F3. And now we see a list of the range names that we've defined so far. The cost of goods sold that we defined using the Define Name functionality in the Define Names group, the commission percent, which we defined using the name box, and sales underscore Q1 to Q4, which we defined using Create from Selection. The space between sales and Q1 was filled in by underscore automatically by Excel, and on cost of goods sold, we see the comment that we've input when we created the name. We can also use the name manager. This is the 4th way to define a name. By pressing New, we get the Define Name dialog box, or the New Name dialog box, and we've seen this before. This is how we created the name for the cost of goods sold. From here, we can input a name, left-click the refers to, select the correct cell, and then acknowledge that, left-click OK. So we've defined names for individual cells, but we can also define a name for a region. And to do that, you can use the name box, you can use the Define Name functionality, and you can use the name manager. You can't use from selection because if you did, we would have 5 named ranges or named cells, A, B, C, D, E. But I'm going to use the name box to define our region. I'm going to call it region. Enter. And left-clicking the name manager, we see that listed third now. Closing it. So we've got a region and several cells that have been named. What can we now do that we couldn't do before? Well, we can use a named range to define an absolute reference. You can use IntelliSense to actually get a list of the named ranges. There's our named ranges for sales. Sales Q1, 2, 3, and 4. I can press Tab and Enter, and I get the sales for Q1. And regardless of where I move that, Control-C, down a couple spaces, Enter, it will always be referencing cell L11 by default. We can change that, but the way we set up the named range, we have an absolute reference because that named range, sales underscore Q1, is cell L11. And it will be whatever value that's in cell L11, so that when I change the value, Enter, the reference, of course, changes as well. We can use it as a formula reference. So if I have equal 100 plus S, and of course I get my list of name ranges with IntelliSense, I get 300 now. You can use the ranges to make formulas more readable. Equal S, sales Q1 times, give it enough to figure out what it is we're after, COMM, commission, and it's 20. And when I look at the formula, it's sales for Q1 times the commission. We already saw the fourth use at work because we can access the data with IntelliSense. And this is easy to overlook. This is a very powerful thing that wherever I am in this workbook, and the workbook could be huge, I can access information that's stored throughout in other places in the workbook by using IntelliSense and typing out the beginning of what it is I'm after. And if your names are intelligent enough, it's a very convenient way to build formulas in your workbook while referencing data that may exist throughout your workbook. I'm going to escape out of that. The fifth common use is to store a value, which is what we did with the commission percent. Since the commission percentage could theoretically change, it's nice to have it available and visible so that when you change it to another percent, any cell that's referencing that will update at the same time. And because you can use the name box to establish named ranges, you can conversely use the name box to navigate to where those ranges will take you. Left-clicking again. The name ranges are listed alphabetically, which can help in finding, obviously, the one you're after. And you can have these name ranges throughout your entire workbook, which may be 10, 20, 30 worksheets large. And the name box is available wherever you are in your workbook. So you can go to a place in your workbook with a named range and then go back to where you came from if those ranges actually take you to another worksheet, which in this case they don't. But it can be a convenient navigational tool. So that's named ranges with cells and regions. The first thing we did was cover the naming rules, and the best thing to do is to find a convention that adheres to the rules and stick with it. We covered 4 ways on how to name a cell. We used the name box. We used the define name functionality in the define names group on the formulas tab. We defined several names for some cells simultaneously with using the from selection functionality. And we used the name manager to define a name. And lastly, we used the name box to define a name for a region as opposed to a cell. And then we covered the common uses for name cells and name regions. You can use name cells and regions to define an absolute reference. You can use them as an argument in a formula as a reference. You can use them to make formulas more readable. You can use English instead of cell references. Name ranges allow access to the data regardless of where you are in your workbook. You can use name cells to store a value that changes infrequently. And you can use name ranges for navigational purposes.